People living near the coast of Washington state have this unspoken rule, even today. When that heavy fog rolls in, they stay entirely away from Dead Man's Sound. I mean, fishermen literally refuse to sail out there after sunset. You'll actually see locals marching down to the water to quietly lock up their docks before a storm hits. And the older residents, they absolutely never speak about Ferry 117. Well, in today's Explainer, we're cracking open the official records and looking at the deeply terrifying anomalies of a ship that just vanished into thin air.
Okay, let's dive into this. The official story claims that back in November of 1974, right in the middle of some severe weather near Puget Sound, Ferry 117 simply disappeared. And here's the most haunting part of that official record. 53 passengers, 53 totally ordinary people, just gone. Vanished right into the heavy coastal fog without a single trace. I mean, think about the sheer impossibility of that number in modern maritime history.
And listen, when I say they vanished, I mean that in the most literal, absolute sense. No wreckage was ever found floating in the water, no bodies washed ashore on any nearby beaches. There wasn't even a frantic distress call to the Coast Guard. Nothing at all. It's like the ocean just opened its jaws and completely erased a massive commercial vessel from existence. That is, of course, until one man finally broke his decades-long silence.
For almost 50 years, the only known survivor, a guy named Thomas Hale, refused every single interview request. He was a former Coast Guard mechanic, just 21 years old when this whole thing happened, and he just lived out his life quietly near Tacoma. But then, in 2023, right before going into hospice care, he finally decided to tell the real story, and he made this absolutely chilling confession. He said, "The ferry never sank. It came back wrong."
Let's move to the timeline and see how this all builds, because to really understand what happened, we need to trace exactly how that fatal night unfolded. It was November 18th, 1974. This massive, thick fog had rolled right across the Sound, but despite the weather warnings, Ferry 117 prepared for its departure at exactly 11:40 p.m. Thomas was actually ordered aboard at the very last minute to do an overnight maintenance inspection. By midnight, so just 20 minutes in, everything changed. And by the time the sun came up, the rescue boats found an entirely different reality waiting for them. Now, at the very beginning of the trip, you had a completely ordinary cross-section of people aboard. Thomas Hale was just a young guy trying to earn some overtime pay. You had families and tourists huddled up together, truckers grabbing a late-night coffee, a priest, 2 musicians, and a little girl carrying a stuffed rabbit. Everything felt perfectly normal, you know? The rain is hitting the windows, the engines are vibrating softly beneath the deck. It created this deeply false sense of security. But exactly 20 minutes into that crossing, the entire atmosphere shifted. Thomas described the fog changing into something he literally called alive. This wasn't just your standard thick coastal weather. It was this unnatural anomaly. The ferry's lights couldn't penetrate more than a few feet into it. The ocean itself completely vanished from view, leaving the ship just floating in this endless white emptiness. And then the ferry horn sounded. Once, twice, 3 times. The thing is, the captain hadn't even touched it. Down below the deck, Thomas was checking the engine pipes when he suddenly heard footsteps right behind him. He spins around and there is this terrified elderly passenger standing right there in the restricted engine room. Thomas frowns naturally and tells him, "Sir, you can't be down here." But the old man is just shaking with pure fear. He looks right at Thomas and says, "There's another ship outside." And this brilliantly illustrates what happened next, because when Thomas rushed back up to the main deck, he saw absolute pure nightmare fuel. On one side, you have Ferry 117. It's lit up, it's moving, the engines are humming. On the other side, just emerging from the fog, is this mirror ship. It was exactly identical in size, same paint job, same company markings, but it had 0 lights. It was moving perfectly silently. And the most horrifying detail of all, the deck of this dark ferry was completely lined with motionless figures with pale faces. They were just staring back like drowned bodies, standing completely upright. Suddenly, the unbelievably deep, incredibly loud horn of the dark ferry blasts right through the whiteout. Almost instantly, the lights on Ferry 117 start violently flickering, and then every single radio on board completely dies, just dead air. At this point, absolute chaos erupts. That boring, ordinary late-night crossing is completely shattered in an instant, and pure panic just sweeps right through the cabin. Right in the middle of all this panic, that little girl with the stuffed rabbit starts crying. Thomas looks over to see what's going on. She's looking through the glass at the silent, dark ferry opposite them. And standing over there, on that ghost ship, is a child, wearing the exact same coat as the little girl on Ferry 117. The girl points through the glass, completely terrified, and screams, "She's looking at me! She took my face!"
And that, my friends, is when the descent into true darkness actually begins. It happened in these terrifying phases. Step 1. All the main lights on Ferry 117 fail completely, plunging 53 people into pitch blackness. Step 2. The dim, incredibly eerie red emergency lights finally kick on, casting these harsh, weird shadows everywhere. And Step 3. As Thomas looks out the window, dozens of pale faces appear. They're floating just beneath the surface of the water, just watching them. And then, without making a single sound, passengers simply start vanishing. 1 second they're right there next to you. The next, they are just gone.
Then the psychological horror truly kicks into overdrive. Remember those radios that had completely died earlier? Well, they suddenly spring right back to life. But they are definitely not broadcasting weather reports or the Coast Guard anymore. Instead, the speakers fill with the voices of the deceased. We're talking dead relatives, lost children, old friends. You can imagine the remaining survivors are just entirely disoriented at this point, their minds completely unraveling as these impossible voices echo through that dark cabin.
And these voices had a devastating effect. Thomas watches this truck driver, who had been fully panicking just moments earlier, suddenly get this very strange, calm smile on his face. He stands up, walks right out onto the rear deck where the fog looks thick enough to be a solid wall, and he just whispers, "My wife's waiting for me." Now, what's really interesting about this slide is what happened when Thomas chased that truck driver out onto the deck. He didn't just see the mere ship. The fog surrounding their ferry was utterly filled with people, hundreds of them, motionless figures wearing clothing from entirely different decades, all standing completely still in that solid white mist, just staring right at him. And right before Thomas's eyes, something violently pulls the truck driver right off the deck, leaving nothing but a splash of blood across the railing. Then the ferry horn sounds again, but this time it's entirely different. It's impossibly close. It's actually vibrating right through the floorboards beneath their feet. And Thomas realizes something that sends him into an absolute primal panic. That second ferry, the mirror ship, it isn't beside them anymore. It had moved below the water. It was now traveling directly underneath Ferry 117.
At this point, the remaining passengers are just openly praying as the ship starts tilting violently to the side. And then bam! Every single window on the port side shatters inward at the exact same time. Freezing seawater explodes into the cabin, and with it come hands. Pale, human hands, just reaching through the darkness. Way too many hands. Passengers are screaming, getting dragged out into the foggy darkness as Thomas is just desperately scrambling his way back toward the engine room.
As he's running, all that screaming starts to fade away, and it's replaced by something that's honestly almost worse. It's soft singing. Thomas sees that little girl again, sitting all alone near the stairs. She's holding her stuffed rabbit, but the rabbit is completely soaked now, just dripping freezing seawater all over the floor. The little girl looks up at Thomas, gives him this really strange smile, and whispers. She says we're almost there.
Thomas somehow makes it into the engine room and locks that heavy metal door securely behind him. And for the rest of the night, he is trapped in pure claustrophobic agony. He sits there for hours, listening to slow, wet footsteps just pacing back and forth across the metal grates of the ship. Every now and then, there's a really gentle knock on the metal door. And then the voices start up again. His dead mother, his dead brother. They're just pleading with him, trying to coax him to open the door and come out into the dark.
So the crucial point here is what happened when dawn finally broke. A massive cover-up began. Once the fog lifted at sunrise, rescue boats found Ferry 117 just drifting there, completely empty except for Thomas, who was found unconscious. Now, the official government report, they blamed rogue waves and mass panic, but the actual rescue crews reported a deeply terrifying reality. The ship had somehow aged decades overnight. It was covered in this thick rust, the paint was peeling off in huge sheets, and the inside smelled strongly of rotten seawater, like it had been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for years. Thomas Hale lived the entire rest of his life absolutely terrified of the fog. But 50 years later, lying in that hospice bed in 2023, his interviewer asked him one final, defining question. It's the question we've all been building toward. What did Thomas really think happened to Ferry 117 out there in the dark?
Thomas stayed perfectly silent for a long time. Then, with this incredibly solemn, crushing weight, the weight of a man who has literally carried a ghost story on his back his entire adult life, he gave his final answer. He simply said, "I think some storms don't lead back home." See, he knew.
He knew that the ship they found the next morning wasn't the same one he had boarded.
But listen, the true unexpected horror of this story does not end with Thomas's words. Because according to the people who were actually in the room during that final interview, just moments after Thomas spoke those words, they heard something. Somewhere outside the hospice window, rolling right through that thick Washington fog, the deep, impossible sound of a ferry horn blasted through the air.